Dr. Keith Baird, Professor of History at Clark Atlanta University. I'm also Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Buffalo State College in New York.
Thank you. Dr. Baird, what is your definition of the African diaspora? When you hear this term, when you use this term, from what base are you operating?
Well, the word itself means dispersion. In fact, the words diaspora and dispersion are etymologically related. And when we talk about the African diaspora, then we're talking about the spread of African people, especially since the say about the 15th century to the present. And in that sense, therefore, we are not talking about the earlier diaspora out of the continent, which has given rise to populations on other continents. We are talking principally about the diaspora that occurred partly in connection with the recruitment, so to speak, of a labor force to be brought to the Americas.
Why is discussion about this topic important?
Well, I think, of course, first of all, it is important because it is a human event. And I like to remind people that it was an African, Marcus Terentius Affer, who said that, he said, I am a human being, and nothing human do I consider not of importance to me, or alien to me. And so it is a human event. It has to do with the movement of human beings over the world, and the kinds of things that people become, what people do, and so on, in the course of such an experience.
How does the focus on the concept of diaspora differ from traditional African American studies?
Yes. At one time, African American studies was considered as having to do principally with the experience of African people in the United States as a result of their captivity in Africa and their forced labor in the United States. Not much attention was paid to the African origin, and in fact, in some instances, it was the Africanity was downplayed. Now, the concept of diaspora makes clear that these Africans whom we encounter in the Americas came from someplace, and that place is Africa. And of course, they came as culture bearers as well as people brought against their will into another environment.
Is the concept African diaspora the same as the often talked about Afrocentric viewpoint?
Not exactly or completely, although there are some elements of similarity. So perhaps I should deal with the Afrocentric viewpoint first. The Afrocentric viewpoint simply states that there is a way of seeing and describing reality from the point of view of people who have had the experience of Africans. Our experience as Africans is different from that of Europeans, since we may accurately say that we were victims in a context in which there were victors. We were the dominated, where they were the dominators. And obviously, there is a difference of perspective. And what people who talk about Afrocentrism are really talking about fundamentally is that there is necessarily a different view of reality and therefore a different presentation of what is to be considered as significant in the situation.
Is this primarily or merely a discussion about race? Is it about other issues like culture or politics?
Well, I'm glad that I'm glad that you raised the question of race, because race is, as Ashley Montague put it so nicely in the title of his book, it is a fallacy. Race is a construct, and that a very vicious concept and construct. It is a construct that came into being as a notion, as a cognitive notion, in connection with the domination and the manipulation of African people, of course, of people who were to be dominated, and in our context it is of African people. And so now, this does not mean that there are not differences, that there are not physical differences between people and so on and so forth, but that what is taken as the criterion, or what are the criteria by which we distinguish between individual A, individual B, group A, group B. What are these criteria? That is what is problematic. And so one may as well decide that, well, height could be a criterion. And of course, or lack of height, fatness, thinness, these merely physical characteristics. Of course, what was chosen to be the main criterion is one which is encapsulated in the colorism reference, black and white, which creates a kind of almost a dialectal opposition. I'm an anthropologist and also, of course, principally a socio-linguist, which means that I look at what people do to language, how language affects people and how people affect language. And this is a notable example that a word is created, or a terminology is created, and then it is created for the purpose of categorizing people, of placing people in certain categories by which then, or on the basis of which, then they can be manipulated. And that is what fundamentally race is. And we know the rather absurd situation in which, even though the terms black and white are supposed to be physical descriptions, some people who would otherwise be considered white, let's say European, might be considered as, quote, black, and vice versa, because actually it is a matter of social construction. And social construction has to do quite a lot with who has the power to define. And the use of the power to define is one of the ways of dominating. So we have not really, as we like to say, formally dominated people, but as people who've gone through the experience of domination, we are not truly emancipated unless we have broken, unless we've destroyed the paradigms which identified us for manipulation, for control by other people.
How does this term, how does the concept of the African diaspora differ from the concept of PanAfricanism, if indeed it does?
Yeah.
Are they one and the same?
Yeah, but not quite, although again they're related. Now, PanAfricanism is principally a political concept, and it says that, Marcus Garvey put it rather well, Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. And I think that indicates that what belongs to Africans should be theirs for their use. And Africans have never been selfish people that they don't want to share, but it is that they should not have their resources controlled by other people, and even themselves as human resources utilized for the satisfaction of others. So Pan-Africanism then is primarily a political idea, whereas when we talk about the notion of the African diaspora, when we talk about historical and cultural continuities, we are dealing with the fundamentally human relationship. And I like to point out that the word human is related to the Latin word humus, which means soil. And thus, when we talk about our humanity, we are talking about that which is our right as persons who originate in a particular environment, we can say, in particular physical environment.
Do you have any concerns as an academic about the way young people, other students are pursuing the study of this notion of diaspora, discussing it? Thinking back to the 60s when there was the Black Studies movement,
yes.
When you think back to that and you look at what's happening now, are there any concerns that you have about the way it's being approached or the forms that the discussions are taking?
Well, I think that we could not have the forms that discussion is taking now, perhaps if we had not had the occurrences of the 60s and the thinking of the 60s. People like to remember that Africans in America, in the Americas we can say, were perceived in different ways at different times, and this has been reflected in the nomenclature utilized. And it is interesting that from a nomenclature that had been imposed by Europeans, we are now moving, even though in European languages, we are moving to a greater sense of self-definition. And that self-definition takes us back to our roots in Africa. We are now saying, much more strongly than ever, we are an African people. We are not blacks. We are not black people. We are not black. Because for that matter, you see, black only, if we were going to accept that as even as a description, black can mean so many things within the semantic range of physical description. So African does it, and then we don't have to get into the question as to hair texture, melanation or not, or lack of melanation and so on. So we are now looking at culture rather than color. And in that context, therefore, the phrase people of color I find a bit problematical, because everybody has color, you see. And if we use that phraseology, people of color, we are back again in the color trap.
What are some of the political implications of this discussion of the African diaspora? The focus on this topic, if any.
Yes. For one thing, because this question of the African diaspora deals with identity, who we are, it also deals very importantly with, well, what we are. What is the totality of the African person, of African people. And this means that we're not talking about some kind of monolithic concept of identity. In fact, we are recognizing that there are different kinds of Africans. We, as Africans, we are a various people. At the same time, We have a good lot in common as to our geographical origin. We have a good lot in common as to the things that happened to us politically over the last 500 years, both on the continent and in diaspora. And in that sense, therefore, we are concerned with where we stand, as it were, on the stage of world events. Because political concerns are who has how much of what. And in that sense, therefore, when we reclaim our identity, we are also making a claim to our ancestral country, both metaphorically and literally. And we are also saying that we have a place on the stage of human events. And in that sense, therefore, it is political. How much power do we exert as human individuals? That's to say, what is our capability as human beings, as other human beings, other persons, Europeans, Asians, and so on, want to express themselves creatively, constructively. So do Africans in all our diversity, in all our variety.
What issues do you think people need to take into consideration when discussing this topic of diaspora?
I think that an important consideration is that when we consider a spread from a point, there is also the consideration implicit in a possible return to that point. Now, it does not necessarily mean a physical return, although it can be. In many cases, and for most of us, it is likely to be what we might call a spiritual return. That's to say that we have a sense of where we came from, and we have a sense of our historical connection. We also have a sense of relationship to those people who are where we came from, that's to say, to autochthonous Africans. We also, as African people, and this is tremendously important, we, as African people, we have a relationship to the whole world. We know very well how we may say that the whole world is in Africa. People from all over are in Africa. But I think that we do not always consider how much Africa is in the world, and that is the point of diaspora.
What do you think when you see the young people and many people wearing African cloth, kente cloth, taking African names? How does that fit in? Is this a reflection of the diaspora, or is it a commercial trend in this?
Oh, I think, well, of course, I like to know that somebody's benefiting from some of this, and that the people who benefit are African people, because that is a way of making a living too. But I think it is more than a trend, because the Malcolm X caps and the T-shirts and so on with African-centered slogans, I think that these are all artifacts of a particular intellectual and emotional orientation. So in that sense, it is a natural thing. One remembers, to use a European reference, remember how in Lays of Ancient Rome there's that phrase, for how can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? And it's not only Europeans have that sense of belonging and connectedness, of sense of the past, sense of respect for our ancestors. In fact, that is a strong element of African thinking, of African practice and conduct of life. And so it is natural. We find more and more people are looking at African ancestral religious practices. I, for example, am an elder in the Ile-Ori temple of Ifa. I was not always so connected. I was always interested in knowing about African spirituality and all of that. But I'm not a member of that temple because I'm looking for something to believe in. I'm rather looking at it because it is a choice that I did not have the opportunity to make at a certain time in my life. But now that I have the opportunity to make it, I make it. Now, many people, of course, come up in a culture, and they're part of that culture. They participate fully in that culture. They have all the rights, dignities, and opportunities and responsibilities of that culture. But we as African people in the Americas and in the United States, in the Caribbean where I was born, we did not have the right to make that choice. It was there. It was considered not a choice. It was considered what was right. What Europeans did was right, you see. And they came with Christianity, they had Christianity, and so that is what we did. So that in looking then at an African religious practice and orientation, it's not a matter necessarily of rejecting others, but it is rather of including that which originally was mine.